greatest discovery of my life came not during the Manhattan Project, but in the quiet years that followed.
You think your body is solid matter, flesh, bone, blood, moving through predictable pathways. You feel substantial, real, separate from the quantum world I spent decades studying. Every doctor, every textbook, every mirror confirms this basic assumption about what you are. But in 1962, 3 years before my death, I uncovered something that shattered this comfortable illusion. The same quantum principles that govern atomic behavior don't stop at your skin. They continue through every cell, every thought, every moment of consciousness. Your body isn't separate from the quantum realm. It is the quantum realm, operating by rules so strange that most people couldn't accept them even if they understood them. What I found changes everything about human potential and healing and the very nature of existence itself.
Before we continue, take a moment to notice where you're listening from. And if this story stays with you, you're welcome to return tomorrow for what comes next.
Princeton, in 1947, felt like sanctuary after the desert years. I returned to the Institute for Advanced Study, carrying more than just classified memories. The weight of what we'd accomplished at Los Alamos pressed against my chest every morning when I woke. But it was the questions that followed me into my new office that would prove most dangerous to my peace of mind. I had become the destroyer of worlds. Now I wanted to understand what worlds actually were. My first lecture notes from that autumn revealed something I had not expected to find in myself. While other physicists celebrated our victory over matter, I found myself obsessed with the observer problem that quantum mechanics had left unsolved. Who or what was doing the observing? And why did observation itself seem to collapse probability waves into concrete reality? These were not idle philosophical musings. During the war, we had learned to split atoms by understanding their internal structures. But atoms, I realized, were not the fundamental building blocks we had assumed. They were probability clouds, existing in multiple states simultaneously until something forced them to choose. The mathematics worked perfectly. The philosophical implications terrified me. I spent my first 6 months at Princeton reviewing every paper Bohr had written about complementarity and the Copenhagen interpretation. The more I studied, the more convinced I became that we were missing something crucial about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. Bohr himself had hinted at this connection, but always pulled back from its full implications. In my private notes from December 1947, I wrote, "If consciousness is required to collapse the wave function, then consciousness must operate outside the normal laws of physics." But consciousness emerges from brains, which are physical systems governed by those same laws. This creates a paradox that cannot be resolved within our current framework. My colleagues thought I was suffering from what we might now call post-war stress. They expected me to focus on nuclear policy or weapons design. Instead, I found myself reading biology papers and attending lectures on neurophysiology. Something about the way neurons fired in patterns reminded me of quantum field fluctuations. The breakthrough moment came during a conversation with Einstein in early 1948. We were walking along the familiar paths near the Institute when he mentioned his continuing discomfort with quantum indeterminacy. "God does not play dice," he said again, as he had many times before. But I found myself responding differently than I had in the past. "Albert, what if God doesn't play dice, because consciousness is the mechanism by which the dice choose their own outcome?" Einstein stopped walking. "Explain this idea, Robert." I tried to articulate what had been forming in my mind for months. We know that observation collapses the wave function, but we have never properly defined what constitutes an observation. We assume it requires a conscious observer, but we treat consciousness as somehow separate from the quantum system being observed. What if consciousness itself is a quantum phenomenon? You are suggesting that the mind operates by quantum principles? I am suggesting something more radical than that. I am suggesting that quantum principles might exist precisely because mind is fundamental to the structure of reality. Einstein listened with the careful attention he gave to all serious ideas, even those he doubted. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "This would make physics much more complicated, my friend, and much more interesting." That conversation changed the direction of my research. I began studying the emerging field of biophysics, looking for evidence that quantum effects persisted at the scale of living systems.
Most physicists assume that quantum coherence would be destroyed by the warm, wet environment of biological tissue, but I suspected they were wrong. I started collaborating with biologists who were measuring unusual phenomena in living cells. We found patterns that suggested quantum entanglement might persist in biological systems far longer than theory predicted. When we observed certain cellular processes, the mere act of measurement seemed to influence outcomes in ways that classical physics could not explain. My notebook from this period contains dozens of experimental designs aimed at testing whether consciousness could directly influence quantum systems. Most of these experiments would not be attempted for another 30 years, but I could see clearly what needed to be tested. The scientific community was not ready for these ideas. When I presented preliminary findings at a physics conference in 1949, the response was politely dismissive.
Quantum mechanics was difficult enough without adding consciousness to the equations. The practical applications of atomic physics were proving tremendously lucrative. Why complicate matters with philosophical speculation?
But I had seen too much during the war to be satisfied with purely practical applications. The bomb had taught me that understanding the fundamental nature of reality was not an academic luxury. It was a moral necessity.
If we were going to wield the power to destroy civilizations, we needed to understand what we were destroying.
By 1950, I filled 3 notebooks with theoretical frameworks that connected quantum mechanics to biological processes. I was developing mathematical descriptions of how consciousness might interface with quantum fields, how observation might work at the cellular level, how intention might influence probability waves in living systems.
None of this work appeared in published papers. The political climate was becoming increasingly hostile to unconventional ideas, especially from someone with my background.
But I continued the research in private, building a foundation that would prove crucial when the real discoveries began. Looking back now, I can see that those early Princeton years were preparation for what was coming. I was learning to think beyond the boundaries that had constrained physics since Newton. I was developing the conceptual tools I would need to understand discoveries that seemed impossible by the standards of 1950. The questions that drove me were simple. If quantum mechanics accurately describes reality at the atomic level, why should it stop applying at larger scales? If consciousness can collapse wave functions in laboratory experiments, what might it be doing in the quantum systems we call living bodies? I did not know then that I would spend the next 15 years discovering answers that would transform everything I thought I knew about human potential. But I could feel something enormous waiting to be understood. And I had learned during the war that when you sense something enormous approaching, the wise response is careful preparation.
I had been reading Sanskrit since my graduate days at Harvard, but it was not until 1952 that the ancient texts began speaking to me about quantum mechanics. What started as intellectual curiosity became something approaching revelation.
The connection emerged while I was struggling with a particular aspect of the observer problem. How could consciousness exist both inside and outside a quantum system simultaneously?
The mathematics suggested that observation required a perspective external to the system being observed, but neuroscience insisted that consciousness arose from brain activity within that same system.
I was reading the Bhagavad Gita in my study one evening when a passage stopped me completely. The soul is neither born, nor does it ever die, nor having once existed, does it ever cease to be.
The soul is without birth, eternal, immortal, and ageless. It is not destroyed when the body is destroyed. In Sanskrit, the word for soul is Atman, but the text described Atman in ways that sounded remarkably like quantum field phenomena.
Eternal, unchanging, present everywhere simultaneously, invisible to ordinary perception but fundamental to all manifest reality. I reached for my notebook and began comparing descriptions. The ancient text spoke of consciousness as the field within which all phenomena arise.
Quantum mechanics described reality as probability waves existing in superposition until collapsed by observation. The parallels were too precise to be coincidental. Over the following months, I systematically studied Vedantic texts alongside quantum theory papers. The correspondence became increasingly clear. Ancient Indian philosophy had developed sophisticated models of consciousness that solved problems Western physics was only beginning to recognize. The Upanishads described 3 levels of reality: gross, subtle, and causal. The gross level corresponded to classical physics, the world of solid objects following predictable laws. The subtle level matched quantum phenomena, probability waves, superposition states, entanglement effects. The causal level described something that Western science had no framework for understanding: pure consciousness as the fundamental ground of being. But the ancient texts went further. They provided detailed descriptions of how consciousness operates at the quantum level. The Mandukya Upanishad outlined 4 states of awareness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and what it called turiya, pure awareness itself. Each state corresponded to different ways consciousness interfaces with quantum fields. I filled page after page with connections. The Sanskrit concept of spanda described the vibratory nature of consciousness that seemed to match quantum field fluctuations. Pratyabhijna, philosophy, described recognition as the fundamental activity of consciousness, strikingly similar to how observation collapses wave functions in quantum experiments. The breakthrough came when I encountered descriptions of siddhas, individuals who had developed extraordinary abilities through understanding consciousness principles. These were not mythological accounts, but systematic descriptions of what became possible when someone learned to operate consciously at quantum levels. According to these texts, consciousness could influence physical reality directly, not through mystical forces, but through precise understanding of how awareness interfaces with quantum fields. The accounts described healing, telepathy, and even what we might now call remote viewing, all explained as natural consequences of consciousness operating according to its fundamental principles. My Western scientific training rebelled against these claims, but the mathematical frameworks I had been developing suggested they might be physically possible. If consciousness could collapse wave functions in laboratory settings, why not in biological systems? If quantum entanglement could persist across vast distances, why not between conscious minds? I began experimenting with meditation practices described in the texts, not from religious motivation, but as scientific investigation. The Vijnana Bhairava described specific techniques for observing consciousness itself. I wanted to understand firsthand how awareness operated at subtle levels. The results surprised me. After several months of consistent practice, I began noticing phenomena that classical neuroscience could not explain. During deep meditation, I sometimes experienced states where the boundary between observer and observed seemed to dissolve. My awareness expanded beyond the normal limits of sensory perception. More importantly, I began noticing correlations between these expanded states and unusual events in my environment. Laboratory equipment would behave differently when I was in certain meditative states. Quantum measurement results would show patterns that aligned with my intentions in ways that probability theory suggested were impossible. I documented these observations carefully, applying the same rigor I used for any scientific investigation. The data was compelling but controversial. I was observing what appeared to be direct consciousness-matter interactions at quantum scales. My annotated copy of the Gita from this period reveals how I was integrating ancient wisdom with modern physics. In the margins, beside Krishna's explanation of how the wise person acts without attachment to results, I wrote, "Non-attached observation equals ideal condition for quantum measurement. Emotional investment in outcome creates observer bias that distorts probability collapse." The Sanskrit texts provided something my physics training had not, a practical methodology for investigating consciousness empirically. Western science studied consciousness by examining brains from the outside. Eastern traditions studied consciousness by training awareness to observe itself directly. Both approaches were necessary. External measurement revealed the neural correlates of consciousness. Internal observation revealed how consciousness actually operates from the first-person perspective. Combined, they suggested a model where consciousness and matter were not separate entities, but different aspects of a single quantum field. The implications were staggering. If the ancient descriptions were accurate, then human potential was far greater than we had imagined. Consciousness was not just an accidental byproduct of neural complexity. It was the fundamental mechanism by which possibility becomes actuality, by which quantum potential collapses into manifest reality. This understanding would prove crucial when my research moved from theoretical frameworks to direct experimentation. The Sanskrit texts had provided me with conceptual tools for understanding phenomena that Western science had no language to describe. But they had also provided something more important: systematic methods for developing the states of consciousness necessary to investigate these phenomena firsthand. I was learning that studying consciousness required more than external observation. It required training consciousness itself as a research instrument. By 1955,
I had integrated ancient wisdom traditions with cutting-edge physics in ways that generated testable hypotheses about consciousness-matter interactions. I had developed meditation practices that could reliably produce expanded states of awareness. And I had begun documenting anomalous phenomena that suggested consciousness operated according to quantum principles. I was ready to begin the experiments that would validate or refute these theoretical frameworks.
I did not yet know that the most important laboratory would turn out to be my own body, and that the most crucial experiment would arise from a health crisis I could never have anticipated.
The Sanskrit texts had taught me that consciousness and matter were intimately connected. I was about to discover just how intimate that connection could be. The first anomaly appeared in December 1957 during what should have been a routine quantum measurement experiment. I had been collaborating with a team of biophysicists at Princeton, investigating whether quantum coherence could persist in biological samples at room temperature. Standard theory predicted that thermal noise would destroy quantum effects within picoseconds. We expected to confirm this prediction and move on to other research. Instead, we discovered something that violated every assumption about how quantum mechanics operates in living systems. The experiment was elegantly simple. We prepared samples of neural tissue from laboratory animals and subjected them to quantum interference measurements.
The setup was identical to classic double-slit experiments, except that we placed thin sections of brain tissue in the path of the coherent photon beam.
According to accepted theory, the biological material should have acted as a source of random interference, destroying the quantum coherence pattern completely. Organic molecules are warm, wet, and noisy, precisely the conditions that eliminate quantum effects in non-biological systems. But that is not what we observed. The neural tissue samples produced interference patterns that were not random. They showed clear evidence of quantum coherence, maintained at temperatures and conditions that should have made such coherence impossible. Even more puzzling, the patterns varied depending on which researcher was operating the measurement equipment. I checked and rechecked our methodology. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The measurement protocols followed standard quantum mechanics procedures. There was no possibility of experimental error. Yet we were consistently observing quantum coherence in biological systems under conditions where such coherence should not exist.
My research notes from January 1958 reveal my growing excitement and confusion. The biological samples are not merely preserving quantum coherence.
They appear to be generating it. The interference patterns show structure and organization that exceeds what we observe in purely physical systems. This suggests that life processes may actually enhance quantum effects rather than destroying them.
We expanded the experiments to include various types of biological tissue. Neural samples from different brain regions showed distinct quantum signatures. Cardiac tissue produced different patterns than liver tissue. Most remarkably, samples from the same organism showed quantum entanglement effects that persisted even after the tissue was no longer living.
But the truly extraordinary discovery emerged when we began testing the effects of conscious observation on these biological quantum systems. When researchers focused their attention on specific aspects of the measurements, the quantum patterns changed in ways that correlated with their intentions. This was far beyond the standard observer effect in quantum mechanics. We were observing what appeared to be direct mind-matter interactions at the quantum level, mediated by biological tissue that somehow amplified rather than dampened these effects. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a neuroscientist working with our team, suggested we test living subjects. With appropriate safety protocols, we began measuring quantum field fluctuations near human volunteers during various mental states. The results challenged everything we thought we knew about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. During normal waking consciousness, subjects showed quantum signatures that correlated with their neural activity.
But during deep meditative states, the quantum patterns became far more coherent and organized.
The subjects appeared to be generating macroscopic quantum fields that extended several inches beyond their physical bodies. More remarkably, when subjects focused their attention on our quantum measurement apparatus, the equipment readings changed in ways that corresponded to their intentions. A subject visualizing increased photon intensity would produce exactly that result. Someone imagining decreased interference would observe reduced coherence in the experimental setup. The effect was reproducible, measurable, and completely inexplicable by conventional physics. We were documenting direct consciousness-matter interactions that suggested human awareness could influence quantum systems through mechanisms we did not understand. I spent months ruling out every possible source of experimental error. We shielded the equipment from electromagnetic interference. We conducted double-blind protocols where subjects did not know what effects they were supposed to produce. We brought in skeptical colleagues to verify our methodology. The results remained consistent. Human consciousness, under specific conditions, could directly influence quantum field behavior in ways that classical physics deemed impossible.
My experimental data sheets from this period show careful documentation of hundreds of trials. Subject after subject demonstrated the ability to influence quantum measurements through focused intention. The effect was strongest in individuals with meditation experience, but was present to some degree in nearly everyone we tested.
The implications were staggering. If consciousness could influence quantum systems directly, then every assumption about the relationship between mind and matter needed to be reconsidered. The brain was not just a classical computer processing information according to chemical and electrical principles. It was a quantum system capable of interfacing with the fundamental structure of reality. But the scientific community was not ready for these discoveries. When I presented preliminary findings at a physics conference in 1959, the response was openly hostile. Colleagues suggested I had fallen victim to experimental bias or wishful thinking. The idea that consciousness could directly influence physical systems was dismissed as pseudoscience. I understood their skepticism. The implications of our discoveries were revolutionary to the point of being threatening. If human consciousness operated according to quantum principles, then free will, personal responsibility, and human potential would need to be reconceptualized completely. Yet the data was unambiguous. We had documented under rigorous experimental conditions direct interactions between consciousness and quantum fields mediated by biological systems. The effect was real, measurable, and reproducible. I began developing theoretical frameworks to explain what we were observing. The key insight was recognizing that biological systems had evolved not just to survive in quantum environments, but to utilize quantum effects for enhanced functionality. Neural networks in particular seemed optimized for maintaining quantum coherence across scales that should have destroyed such effects. Consciousness, rather than being an emergent property of classical neural computation, appeared to be a quantum field phenomenon that interfaced with physical reality through specialized biological structures. The brain was not generating consciousness so much as focusing and amplifying consciousness that existed as a fundamental aspect of quantum fields. This model explained our experimental observations while suggesting possibilities for human development that seemed almost science fictional. If consciousness could influence quantum systems directly, then focused awareness might be capable of influencing any system that operated according to quantum principles, which, according to modern physics, included everything in the universe. By 1960, I had accumulated compelling evidence that human consciousness operates according to quantum mechanical principles and can influence physical reality through direct field interactions. The data was carefully documented, the experimental protocols were rigorous, and the results were reproducible. But I was also beginning to realize that understanding these phenomena intellectually was very different from experiencing them directly. The next phase of my research would move beyond laboratory measurements to personal experimentation. I was about to discover that the most important quantum system I could study was the one I inhabited every moment of my life. My own body was about to become both laboratory and research instrument in ways I could never have imagined. The cancer diagnosis came in March 1960, delivered with the clinical detachment I had once applied to physics problems. Throat cancer, likely linked to years of cigarette smoking. The doctors spoke of surgery, radiation, chemotherapy. They gave me statistics about survival rates and treatment options. I listened to their explanations with the same attention I had once given to weapons efficiency calculations. But underneath their words, I was calculating something else entirely. This disease was not just a medical problem. It was an opportunity to test everything I had learned about consciousness and quantum fields under the most demanding conditions possible. My body had become the ultimate experimental apparatus. The irony was not lost on me. I had spent a decade studying how consciousness might influence quantum systems. Now I would discover whether consciousness could influence the quantum systems that comprise my own physical existence. My medical records from this period show the conventional progression of cancer treatment: surgery to remove tumors,
radiation therapy to destroy remaining malignant cells, medications to manage pain and side effects.
The treatments were aggressive, necessary, and largely effective according to standard medical measures. But I was conducting a parallel experiment that my doctors knew nothing about. Every morning, before submitting to the day's medical procedures, I spent 2 hours in deep meditation, applying the consciousness techniques I had learned from Sanskrit texts, combined with quantum field theory I had developed through laboratory research. I was not rejecting medical treatment. I was augmenting it with approaches that conventional medicine had no framework for understanding. The meditation practice was unlike anything I had experienced before. Instead of simply observing my breath or maintaining awareness of present moment experience, I was learning to focus consciousness at the quantum level of cellular activity.
I would begin by establishing the expanded awareness states I had practiced for years, but then I would direct that awareness inward, toward the specific tissues affected by cancer.
Using visualization techniques combined with quantum field mathematics, I would imagine myself observing cellular activity at the molecular level.
The experience was extraordinary. I could sense what I can only describe as the quantum coherence patterns of healthy cells versus malignant ones. Healthy tissue felt organized, harmonious, aligned with natural quantum rhythms. Cancerous tissue felt chaotic, disconnected from the larger quantum field that coordinated biological processes. But the crucial discovery was that focused awareness could influence these patterns directly. During deep meditative states, I found I could sense the quantum field fluctuations that governed cellular behavior. With patient practice, I learned to introduce coherence into areas where chaos had taken hold. I could not cure cancer through meditation alone, but I could support the healing process by restoring quantum organization to compromised biological systems. The results were measurable. My recovery rate exceeded statistical expectations for someone with my stage of cancer. More importantly, I was experiencing firsthand how consciousness interfaces with physical reality at the quantum level. In my private journal from August 1960, I wrote, "The boundary between observer and observed is dissolving. When I focus awareness on cellular activity, I am not merely watching biological processes. I am participating in them. Consciousness does not exist outside the quantum systems it observes. It exists within them as the organizing principle that determines how quantum possibilities collapse into physical reality." This understanding transformed my entire relationship with the illness. Instead of being a victim of random cellular malfunction, I began to see cancer as a breakdown in quantum coherence that could be addressed through techniques that combined medical intervention with conscious participation in the healing process. I was not engaging in magical thinking or denial of physical reality. I was applying rigorously tested principles of quantum mechanics to the most personal laboratory available to me. Every day brought new data about how consciousness operates within living quantum systems. The meditation practices revealed layers of subtlety I had not anticipated. At surface levels, I could influence simple physical processes like heart rate and blood pressure. At deeper levels, I could sense and modify the quantum field patterns that coordinated immune system responses. At the deepest levels, I began to experience what I can only describe as direct participation in the intelligence that governs biological organization. This was not the mechanistic intelligence of classical physics, where complex behavior emerges from simple interactions between separate parts. This was quantum intelligence, where individual components exist in superposition states that become determined only through interaction with conscious observation. My body was not a machine that I inhabited. It was a quantum field phenomenon that existed in constant relationship with consciousness. Health and illness were not fixed states, but ongoing processes of quantum coherence and decoherence, influenced by factors that included but extended far beyond genetic predisposition and environmental toxins. The cancer treatment succeeded medically, but the real cure came from learning to participate consciously in the quantum processes that maintain biological organization. I had discovered that healing was not something that happened to me through external medical intervention. It was something that happened through me, as consciousness learned to function according to its natural quantum principles. By late 1960, I was cancer-free according to medical tests. But more importantly, I had validated, under the most demanding personal conditions, everything my laboratory research had suggested about consciousness-matter interactions. The implications extended far beyond medical applications.
If consciousness could influence biological quantum systems during illness, it could presumably influence them during health as well.
The human potential for physical, mental, and even spiritual development might be limited not by fixed biological constraints, but by our understanding of how to work consciously with quantum field principles. I had experienced directly that consciousness was not produced by the brain, but interfaced with physical reality through biological quantum systems.
The brain was more like a radio receiver that could be tuned to different frequencies of awareness, each frequency providing access to different aspects of quantum field information. During my deepest healing meditations, I sometimes experienced states of awareness that seemed to extend far beyond the boundaries of my physical body. I could sense the quantum field patterns of people near me, the electromagnetic signatures of local environments, even what felt like information flowing through global consciousness networks. These experiences were not hallucinations or fantasies. They corresponded to measurable changes in my physiology and correlated with observable events in my environment.
I was discovering that individual consciousness was connected to larger patterns of awareness that operated according to quantum field principles. The recovery from cancer had become a doctoral program in applied quantum consciousness. I had learned not just to think about how awareness might influence reality, but to participate consciously in the quantum processes that create and maintain physical existence. This direct experience would prove crucial for the next phase of my research. I was ready to develop mathematical frameworks that could describe precisely how consciousness interfaces with quantum fields. I was ready to create theoretical models that could predict and explain the phenomena I had observed, both in laboratory experiments and personal healing work. Most importantly, I was ready to integrate everything I had learned into a comprehensive understanding of human nature that could transform how we think about consciousness, health, potential, and the fundamental relationship between mind and matter. The cancer had been far more than a medical crisis. It had been an initiation into the deepest principles governing the relationship between consciousness and physical reality.
The mathematical breakthrough came in January 1961, 6 months after my recovery, while I was reviewing quantum field equations in my study at Princeton.
I had been struggling to develop a formal description of how consciousness interfaces with quantum systems when I noticed something that had been hidden in plain sight for decades. The wave function collapse that occurs during quantum measurement was not random, as Copenhagen interpretation suggested. It was guided by information patterns that exhibited the same organizational principles I had observed in conscious awareness during my healing work. I spent the next 3 months developing equations that could describe this relationship mathematically. The key insight was recognizing that consciousness and quantum fields were not separate phenomena that occasionally interacted. They were different aspects of a single underlying field that manifested as both subjective experience and objective physical reality.
In my theoretical manuscript from this period, I wrote, "Consciousness is not an emergent property of complex neural networks.
It is the fundamental field within which quantum possibilities are evaluated and selected. What we call physical reality is the subset of quantum possibilities that consciousness has collapsed into manifest form."
This framework required a complete reconceptualization of how biological systems operate. Neural networks were not classical computers that processed information through purely chemical and electrical interactions.
They were quantum processing systems that maintained coherence across scales that classical physics deemed impossible. The mechanism operated through cellular structures called microtubules, protein networks that existed within every neuron. These microtubules functioned as quantum processing units, maintaining entanglement relationships that allowed conscious awareness to interface directly with quantum field fluctuations throughout the nervous system. But the nervous system was only the most obvious example of biological quantum processing. Every cell in the human body contains similar quantum coherence structures. DNA itself operated according to quantum principles, storing and accessing information through mechanisms that involved consciousness as an active participant rather than a passive observer. The mathematics revealed how intention and awareness could create measurable changes in biological quantum fields. When consciousness focused on specific outcomes, it did not violate physical laws. It utilized quantum field principles that operated according to precise mathematical relationships. The key equation described the relationship between conscious intention and probability wave collapse. Psi, collapsed, equals integral psi. Superposition times C, intention, times F, biological coherence,
dt, where C, intention, represented the consciousness field component, F, biological coherence, represented the quantum processing capacity of biological systems, and the integral described how these factors interacted over time to determine which quantum possibilities became manifest reality. This equation explained everything I had observed during my healing work and laboratory experiments. Consciousness was not somehow outside the laws of physics, manipulating matter through mysterious forces. It was operating according to quantum field principles that made the direct influence of awareness on physical systems not only possible but inevitable. The implications were revolutionary. Human potential was limited not by fixed biological constraints, but by our understanding of how to work consciously with quantum field principles. Health, creativity, intelligence, and even what we might call spiritual development were all expressions of consciousness learning to function according to its natural quantum properties. During my deep meditative states, I began testing these theoretical frameworks experimentally. I would focus awareness on specific biological processes and measure the results using increasingly sophisticated monitoring equipment I had installed in my home laboratory. The data confirmed my mathematical predictions. Focused consciousness could influence heart rate variability, immune system function, neural coherence patterns, and even genetic expression in ways that correlated precisely with the quantum field equations I had developed. But the most remarkable discovery was that consciousness could access information through quantum field interactions that extended far beyond the boundaries of individual biological systems. During expanded awareness states, I could sense environmental, electromagnetic patterns, social field dynamics, and what appeared to be information flowing through collective consciousness networks. This was not mystical speculation, but measurable quantum field phenomena. Consciousness operated through entanglement relationships that connected individual awareness to larger patterns of information and organization that existed at planetary and possibly cosmic scales. My private research notes from late 1961 document hundreds of experiments in which I tested the range and precision of consciousness field interactions. I could influence the behavior of quantum measurement apparatus in my laboratory through focused intention. I could sense the emotional and physical states of people at distances that precluded normal sensory communication. I could access information about events and locations that I had never visited through what could only be described as quantum field interfaces. Each experiment provided additional validation for the theoretical framework, while revealing new layers of complexity in how consciousness operates according to quantum principles. The human brain was not generating consciousness through neural complexity. It was focusing and amplifying consciousness that existed as a fundamental aspect of quantum fields. This understanding explained why meditation practices from ancient traditions could produce such profound effects on health and awareness. These practices were not based on religious beliefs or cultural conditioning. They were sophisticated technologies for training consciousness to operate according to its natural quantum field principles. The Sanskrit texts I had studied years earlier contained precise descriptions of consciousness development that corresponded perfectly to the quantum field mathematics I was developing. Ancient practitioners had discovered through direct experience the same principles that modern physics was beginning to understand theoretically. But they had gone far beyond theoretical understanding. They had developed systematic methods for actualizing the full potential of consciousness, operating according to quantum principles. The abilities they described, healing through intention, telepathic communication, direct perception of distant events, were natural expressions of consciousness functioning according to its fundamental quantum properties. By the end of 1961, I had developed a complete theoretical framework that explained how consciousness interfaces with physical reality through quantum field mechanisms mediated by biological systems. The framework was mathematically rigorous, experimentally validated, and consistent with both modern physics and ancient wisdom traditions. The key principles were surprisingly elegant. Consciousness exists as a fundamental quantum field that underlies all physical phenomena. Biological systems evolved as interfaces that allow consciousness to focus and direct quantum field interactions. Health, creativity, and human development are expressions of consciousness learning to operate according to its natural quantum principles. The implications extended to every aspect of human existence. Education could be redesigned to teach consciousness development alongside intellectual learning. Medicine could integrate quantum field approaches with conventional treatments. Technology could be developed that enhanced rather than substituted for natural consciousness capacities.
But I was also becoming aware that these discoveries carried responsibilities that extended beyond personal development or scientific advancement.
If consciousness could influence physical reality directly, then every thought, intention, and emotional state was contributing to the creation of collective reality through quantum field interactions. The same consciousness principles that allowed for individual healing and development were also shaping social, political, and environmental conditions through mechanisms that most people had no awareness of. Understanding consciousness as a quantum field phenomenon was not just personally empowering, it was ethically demanding. I was beginning to realize that the next phase of human evolution would require not just technological advancement, but consciousness development on a scale that current educational, social, and political systems were not equipped to support. The theoretical framework was complete. The experimental validation was overwhelming. But the real question was whether humanity was ready for the responsibilities that came with understanding consciousness as the fundamental creative force in quantum reality.